Hello, everyone. I'm John Crippen, Director of Hennepin History Museum, and I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This event's been a long time coming, and since it was originally envisioned for last year and turned out to be our first program taken down by COVID. So we're so grateful for everyone who's persevered to bring this night into a reality. I want to do some quick acknowledgements and housekeeping, and then pass it over to our main speakers. Hennepin History Museum is pleased to partner here with the Plymouth Congregational Church, Alliance Housing Incorporated, and Align Minneapolis. And on behalf of all the partners, we want to give special thanks to the Minneapolis Foundation and the Pohlad Family Foundation for generous early support to make this event a reality. Just to acknowledge the current reality we're in, the past 2 weeks have been an intense whirlwind of emotion, both here and across the country. The police killing of Daunte Wright in Brooklyn Center and his funeral tomorrow weigh heavily on us all. Yesterday's guilty verdicts in the Derek Chauvin trial gave so many people a brief respite of relief, but also underscored the hard work yet to do. And then we hear news of another police killing, now of Makia Bryant, a Black teenager in Columbus. So this terrible pattern continues to buffet us, and we appreciate all of you who are gathered here tonight with feelings of anger, pain, exhaustion, but also enough hope to confront our shared history together. Indeed, this brutal succession of events keeps us at Hennepin History Museum mindful of why we're doing this work in the first place. We want to bring light on the past and participate in forging a better future. So we'll continue to seek partners like all of you to accomplish this. Some of you have registered for last week's panel of local historians and housing experts who plan to discuss our local history of racism in housing in order to find ways to move forward. We look forward to rescheduling that conversation, and by then informed by the national perspective given tonight by Richard Rothstein. So some housekeeping. As we finish up with Richard's talk, if you've got questions, please use the Q&A function for questions to Chanda or to Richard, and use the chat window for any tech support needs that you have or comments to other participants. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm delighted now to introduce the Reverend Dr. Dwayne Davis of Plymouth Congregational Church, who in addition to his many gifts in ministry, also comes with some serious public policy chops of his own. Dr. Davis, will you introduce our speaker and moderator for this evening?
John, thank you so much. I am so happy to be here to introduce our speakers for the day, and just so proud because, and a little caught up short because their reputations, of course, precede them. John, thank you for Hennepin History Museum for sponsoring this and partnering with us. We really appreciate that opportunity and that partnership, and I hope this means that we will be doing a lot more in the future. I am excited about these two people, like I said, because their reputations precede them. And on behalf of Plymouth Congregational Church, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you and them specifically to this work, especially Chanda Smith Baker, who for more than 20 years has been working in and around this area for underserved communities. And from her perch at the Minneapolis Foundation, which she joined in 2017, she has been overseeing the grant-making program. She's been doing the strategic capacity building for communities, developing partnerships with all these people who are doing on-the-ground work, which is very important in the Twin Cities. And I am so proud that she is here. I had a chance to be on a call with her earlier, and I told her, I can't wait to get on the other side of this pandemic so that we can meet in person and do good work together. Previously, she was at the Pillsbury United Communities and assumed the role of CEO there for a time. And then our special guest, Richard Rothstein, who is a distinguished fellow at Economic Policy Institute. That was the first place that I interned in college when I was at Howard University in Washington, D.C. And so I'm very familiar with the Economic Policy Institute. And Richard Rothstein is also a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And we all know about that wonderful book, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of Our Government Segregated America. I have both read the book and listened to it in podcasts on my walks throughout the Twin Cities last summer. And the only thing I can say, Dr. Rothstein, is that I wish I had had this when I was a staffer on the Appropriations Committee in the United States House of Representatives working on housing and urban development funding. I just wish I'd had that book and that information at my fingertips. But I am just so proud to have them because that book really does explore the forgotten history, the amnesia around that history of how the federal, state, and local policy explicitly segregated many of the metropolitan areas nationwide that we are still, the impact of which we are still living with. And it is just important that we continue to call that out and to make sure that we never forget that. Before I turn it over to Chanda and Richard, I do just want to again thank all of the people who have helped make this possible. Hennepin History Museum, Alliance Housing Incorporated, the Minneapolis Foundation. I want to give a special thanks to Catherine Shreves for the role that she played in making sure when I first came on board at Plymouth that I knew about this and that I would be able to join this. And I'm so happy she gave me that opportunity. So thank you so much. And so now the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Dwayne. Thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this. Thanks to all of you for your courage in Minneapolis in the last very troubling times that you've gone through and are continuing to go through. I'm going to talk to you this evening mostly about the national context in which the struggles that you face were created. And I look forward to engaging with you in a discussion after I'm finished and perhaps talking more specifically about how it relates to your city. As you all know, in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in law schools, and then in colleges and universities. And then in 1954, that civil rights movement succeeded in getting the Supreme Court to prohibit legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. And that Brown decision, as many of you know, gave impetus and stimulus, inspiration to a movement of activists who engaged in marches and demonstrations, civil disobedience. People lost their lives in that struggle. And but by the end of the 1960s, that civil rights movement had pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everyone, but much of the country, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. And with that understanding, and with its direct action and good trouble, it persuaded the country to abolish segregation and public accommodations in interstate transportation, local transportation, mostly in employment. And then in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a fair housing law passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then the civil rights movement pretty much ended at the end of the 1960s, and it left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. All that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black or mostly black. How could it be if we came to an understanding, widely shared, that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both African Americans and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy? How could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, partly it's because undoing residential segregation, once we've created it, is hard. If we pass an ordinance prohibiting the segregation of restaurants, the next day you go to any restaurant you want, sitting where you want in that restaurant. But if we pass a law prohibiting the segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things would look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, Northerners, Southerners, Democrats, Republicans, we've adopted a national rationalization, an excuse we give ourselves for tolerating the continued segregation of this country, for having an apartheid society and doing nothing to change it. And that rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the segregation forms that we abolished in the 20th century, whether of colleges and universities or schools or public accommodations or interstate transportation, that was all done by government. If the federal government was doing it, it was a violation of the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, a civil rights violation. And we understand that we have an obligation as Americans to redress civil rights violations, to fix them. If state and local governments were doing it, it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, a civil rights violation as well. Also something that we as American citizens have an obligation to remedy. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government. It wasn't done by law, by ordinance, by public policy, by regulation. That just sort of happened naturally. It happened by accident. We have residential segregation maybe because bigoted white homeowners or landlords refuse to sell or rent to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it happened because private businesses, banks, real estate agencies, developers, insurance companies discriminated in how they carried out their private sector activities. Or maybe it happened naturally just because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way. Or maybe it happened just for economic reasons. African Americans, on average, have lower incomes than whites. And so many African Americans can afford to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods that are all white or mostly white. All of these individual, bigoted, but private sector decisions, self-choice, economic differences is what's created segregation. We give a name to this. We say that what we have is de facto segregation. Something just happened in fact, not in law. And we tell ourselves that if we have de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government has no responsibility to fix it. We may think it's too bad, but it's not our government's job to fix it. Somehow it has to unhappen as naturally as it happened. Well, I spent much of my career before I wrote this book, The Color of Law, that I'm going to talk about a bit this evening, writing about education policy. I wasn't writing about housing or residential issues. In the 1990s and 2000s, part of that time I was the education columnist at the New York Times. I wrote a weekly column on education. As you heard, I was the education writer at the Economic Policy Institute. I came to understand that the education policies that we were following in this country in the 1990s and 2000s made no sense whatsoever. I thought they were ridiculous. And I wrote about them constantly. The dominant educational theory of the country at that time is that there was an achievement gap between Black and white students. Black children, on average, achieved at lower levels than white children. And the reason for that achievement gap, we told ourselves, is that teachers in schools just didn't try very hard to educate Black children. Teachers were bigoted, schools didn't hold them accountable. And that's the reason that we have an achievement gap. And so pursuing this theory, we adopted a national law that was supported across the political spectrum, Democrats and Republicans. The law was called the No Child Left Behind law, and it in 2001, and it required that children be tested every year and required that schools and teachers be held accountable for those test scores. And the law actually predicted that if we did this, if we tested children every year and held teachers and schools accountable for those test scores, the achievement gap would disappear in 7 years. There'd be no difference between the achievement of Black and white children. I thought this was a ridiculous theory. It's true that some teachers don't try very hard to teach Black children. Some schools don't make them try very hard, but that's a small cause of the achievement gap between Black and white children. The main reason that African-American children achieve at lower levels typically than white children is because so many Black children come to school with serious social and economic challenges that make it more difficult for them to benefit from good instruction. And so I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, in this country and in many, many cities, African-American children have asthma at as much as 4 times the rate of middle-class children. 4 times the rate. It's an enormous difference. They have asthma at such a high rate because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving by their homes, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely, not in every case, but more likely than a child who doesn't have asthma, to perhaps be up at night wheezing, and then coming to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial composition, same social and economic background, same family structure, same economic circumstances, but one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have slightly lower achievement, simply because it's going to be a sleepier group in school. Well, it doesn't make a big difference, but then you begin to think of all of the other social and economic challenges that African-American children, so many of them come to school with that white children don't face. Lead poisoning, as you may know, lead poisoning is much more prevalent in Black than in white neighborhoods because African Americans typically live in more deteriorated buildings, more paint peeling, less modernized pipes bringing water to their homes, and lead poisoning has a measurable impact on IQ. Homelessness, economic insecurity, all of these have a similar impact on academic achievement. And if you begin to add them all up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap, leaving very little to explain with low teacher expectations. But nonetheless, we pursued this theory. I began to think about it more, and I realized that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity, but what happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges? How can you ever expect such a school to achieve at the same level as a school where children come well-rested, well-nourished, in good health, in economically secure homes? You can't have that expectation no matter how many laws you pass requiring it. The reality is that No Child Left Behind law was passed in 2001. It's been an utter failure. The achievement gap is as great now as it was then. The only thing that law succeeded in doing is getting schools to abandon a well-rounded curriculum for African-American children so they could devote more of their time to drilling them in test-taking skills. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with all of those disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they ever have been at any time in the last 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think, I was still an education policy writer, I began to think that neighborhood segregation maybe wasn't only a housing issue, it was an educational issue. And as an education policy analyst, I needed to be concerned about neighborhood segregation. So I was thinking along these lines, and then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision. It involved 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those districts had implemented a very token school desegregation plan to try to address the conditions that I was just describing. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the choice was going to exacerbate segregation, it wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a parent whose child wouldn't do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, you had a couple of places left, and both a Black and a white child applied for the last remaining places. The Black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program. You don't have just a few places left in the school very often, and children of different races apply for it. But the Supreme Court evaluated this program, denounced it. The opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. He explained that it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. He said they're segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. That was a pretty wise decision, a wise observation on the part of the Chief Justice. That's the reason that schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. And then he went on to explain that the neighborhoods are segregated de facto for all the reasons I described before: private bigotry, the actions of private businesses, self-choice, and economic differences. And he said, well, you have de facto segregation, something that wasn't created by government. Government is prohibited from doing anything explicitly to redress it. Well, I read this decision and I remembered something that had happened some years before in one of those two school districts, Louisville, Kentucky. In Louisville, there was a white suburb, all white suburb of single family homes called Shively. In that town of Shively, there was a white homeowner in a single family home, as were all homes in Shively, who had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of Shively bought a second home in his community and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in, a mob of white residents surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop it. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop it. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a Black family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. The police, the courts, the criminal justice system, these are state actors. They're agents of the state. This is a 14th Amendment violation, not de facto segregation, something that we've never remedied. And I began to look into it further, and I found that there were hundreds and hundreds of cases. I'm not exaggerating with these numbers. Hundreds and hundreds of cases of police protected, sometimes even police organized and led, violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in white neighborhoods. Every one of these, where the police were involved in either protecting, leading, or organizing violence to enforce segregation, was a 14th Amendment violation, something that we have an obligation to remedy. These instances didn't just happen in border states like Kentucky. They existed in Minneapolis, in New York, and Chicago, and Detroit, and Baltimore, and Denver, and Los Angeles, and San Francisco, were instances of state-sponsored violence designed to enforce racial boundaries to make sure that African Americans and whites couldn't live near one another in any metropolitan area of this country. I then put aside my study of education policy and decided to look into this further. And I found that it wasn't just state-sponsored violence that created and maintained and reinforced the segregation that we know today, but there were many, many policies of the federal, state, and local governments, racially explicit policies that we've all forgotten, but that ensured that we have an apartheid society in this country. I will spend a few minutes this evening speaking with you about some of these policies. Let me begin with perhaps the most powerful one. This was a policy of the federal government to move the entire white working class and middle class population out of cities into single family homes in all white suburbs in the post-World War II period. At the time, we weren't a suburban country. Most whites and African Americans were living in downtown urban areas. We were a manufacturing economy at that time. There was no internet or other non-manufacturing activity to speak of, and factories needed to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals so that they get their parts and ship their final products by rail or by boat. And workers who didn't have automobiles typically, as well as the employees of banks that were servicing these manufacturing enterprises and other service industries, had to locate and live close enough to be able to walk to work or maybe take short streetcar rides. The result was that we actually had many integrated neighborhoods. in the early 20th century, many more than we have today. We'd be stunned if we were transported back in that period of time to see the extent of integration that existed, not everywhere, but in many places. But the federal government determined a program to move the whites only out of those urban areas into single-family homes in suburban communities. The most famous of these, perhaps you've heard of it, but they exist in every area in Minneapolis as well as everywhere else. But the most famous of these was Levittown, east of New York City. 17,000 homes east of New York. The developer, William Levitt, could never have assembled the capital to buy the land and build 17,000 homes in one place. Banks thought he was crazy. They would never lend him the money to do it. We weren't, I just mentioned, a suburban country at the time. They didn't think this was a feasible idea. The only way that Levitt could buy the land, build the homes, was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration. This was post-World War II. Submit his plans for the project, the construction materials he's going to use, the architectural design of the homes, the layout of the streets, and a required commitment that he never sell a home to an African American. The FHA even required Levitt and many of these other builders around the country to place a clause in the deed prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. And you in Minneapolis are very familiar with these clauses. You have a project out of the university that's been identifying these deeds throughout the Minneapolis and now the St. Paul area. This was a federal requirement in the post-World War II period. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government to live in these homes once the FHA and VA granted Levitt a guarantee for his bank loans to build them. The white families, returning war veterans and urban workers, moved into these suburban homes that were inexpensive. They sold at the time in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s for around $8,000 or $9,000 a piece. These were modest homes for working class families. In today's dollars, that's about $100,000. Any family with a job in the post-war boom, blacks and whites, can afford a home for $100,000, especially with a 20-year FHA or VA mortgage. Returning war veterans were required, black or white, would have been required to make no down payment on the home. Blacks were prohibited from participating in this program, but whites were subsidized to do it. This requirement that these suburbs be all white was not the action of rogue bureaucrats working for the FHA and VA. It was a written policy of the federal government. The federal government had an underwriting manual that it distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to create these suburban subdivisions. The underwriting manual said explicitly that you could not recommend for a federal bank guarantee a development that was going to include African Americans in a white development. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white project that was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, and I quote, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. In my book, The Color of Law, I have a photograph of a 6-foot-high, half-mile-long concrete wall that the developer of an all-white project in the Detroit area was required by the FHA to construct to separate his project from a nearby African-American neighborhood before it would guarantee his bank loans. This notion of de facto segregation is utter nonsense. We created a white noose around black neighborhoods in every metropolitan area of this country by federal requirement. De facto segregation is utter nonsense. Well, the white families who moved into these, as I say, in today's money, about $100,000, these $100,000 homes, saw their homes over the next couple of generations appreciate in value. I don't know about Minneapolis, but I doubt you could buy a home there in any of these suburbs for $100,000. They typically around the country cost $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, in some places much, much more. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government to move into these homes gained over the next couple of generations wealth from the equity appreciation in their homes. They used this wealth to send their children to college. They used it to finance perhaps emergencies or temporary unemployment. They used it to subsidize their retirements. And they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of white family incomes. You would think that African American wealth would also be on average about 60% of white wealth. Families can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, while African American family incomes average about 60% of white family incomes, African American wealth, household wealth, averages about 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between the 60% income ratio and the 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century that we as American citizens have an obligation to remedy, and that an obligation that we've never accepted. Well, that wealth gap supports the ongoing racial segregation that we have today. This is not a historical curiosity. It's the cause of much of our racial inequality. Let me begin by mentioning the one that you're most familiar with these days, and that's police abuse of African Americans. I'm not suggesting that no police officer, like Chauvin, would ever abuse an African American young man. Some would, but the abuse is much, much more intense and systematic because of segregation. When we concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods from which they have difficulty exiting because they have no wealth to be able to afford homes in higher opportunity places. We concentrate those young men in places where they don't have access to good jobs, or they don't have transportation to get to good jobs, where they don't have access to schools that aren't overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their children. It's inevitable that the police will engage in confrontations with them, that the police will adopt the stance of an occupying force, not the role they play in white neighborhoods. The police in segregated, low-income Black neighborhoods behave the same way that occupying forces behave in colonial nations in the 20th century, whether it's the British in India or the Belgians in the Congo. This is a police force whose role it is to keep a restive, disaffected, disadvantaged population under control. And the tactics that they adopt for that purpose are unconstitutional tactics that would never be tolerated in a place where the police's role was not to keep the population under control. Stopping and frisking young men, for example, a completely unconstitutional policy when there's no cause for such a stop, but it's tolerated because the police's role is to keep the population tightly controlled. Well, the wealth gap that we created with this policy I described not only explains a good part of police abuse of African Americans and the mass incarceration that results from it. It also explains, as I explained at the beginning, the achievement gap that we experience in schools because we concentrate the most disadvantaged children in single schools and single neighborhoods. It explains health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease because so many of them are concentrated in less healthy neighborhoods with more of the pollution I described earlier, less access to markets that sell fresh food. That's the ongoing consequence of just this one policy that I described, the policy of the FHA and VA to move whites out of urban areas into single family homes in white suburbs. There were many, many other policies that were followed. I'll mention one other federal policy now, and that's public housing, something that I think most of us misunderstand. We think public housing is a place where poor people live. Lots of young women with single women with children, lots of those young men I was talking about a minute ago who don't have jobs in the formal economy. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the New Deal, in the Great Depression of the 1930s and the Roosevelt administration. It was not for the poor. We had an unemployment rate at that time in this country of about 25%. Public housing was for the 75% who had jobs, consistent jobs, and the incomes to support paying full rent in public projects. They weren't subsidized. If you look at my book, The Color of Law, the frontispiece is a picture of Franklin Roosevelt giving the keys to the 100,000th family to get public housing in this country in the 1930s. If you look at that picture, you can see it's a middle-class white crowd. And the family that's getting the keys is clearly a well-dressed white family. That's what public housing was. The first public housing, as I say, built in this period throughout the country, not for poor people, but to address a housing crisis. But everywhere that the Public Works Administration and subsequent federal agency built this public housing, it segregated it, creating segregation frequently where it hadn't previously existed. I mentioned earlier that we had much more integration in those years than we have today. The great African-American poet, novelist, playwright Langston Hughes describes in his autobiography how he grew up in a downtown integrated Cleveland neighborhood. He said he went to an integrated high school in that neighborhood. His best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl there. It was an integrated high school, an integrated neighborhood. But the Public Works Administration in the New Deal went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and created two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in Cleveland and with other segregated projects elsewhere in that area that exists to this day. In The Color of Law, I like where I can to devote a page or two to self-satisfied smug places that think they're better than the rest of the country. One of them I describe is Cambridge, Massachusetts. Perhaps you've heard of it. The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was an integrated neighborhood in the 1930s. It was about half white and half black. Public Works Administration and other federal agencies went into that neighborhood, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed, and with other equally segregated projects elsewhere in the Boston area, reinforced the pattern that still exists to this day. The West Coast was segregated in this way. As if you know the history of the migration of African Americans out of West Coast, out of the former slaveholding states into the West Coast, you know that it didn't much happen until World War II. Large migrations of African Americans came to the Midwest during World War I, but not until World War II, to take jobs that hadn't existed during the Depression, along with white migrants in the shipbuilding and aircraft industries in particular. They overwhelmed the West Coast cities where they came to take these jobs. The government had to find housing if it wanted the planes and the ships to be produced, and it did. It created segregated housing for the workers who were working in the same war plants, separate projects for whites and blacks. In San Francisco, another one of those smug places, it built 5 projects, 4 for whites only, 1 for African Americans, and that became the African American neighborhood of San Francisco. Across the San Francisco Bay in Berkeley, it built a project, divided buildings for whites and African Americans. The whites were placed in buildings along the residential area near shopping. The African Americans were placed in buildings along the railroad tracks and in the industrial area without access to shopping and higher amenities. This was a pattern throughout the country. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. Policy experts, think tanks, journalists like me, we write about them all the time. The problem is not the lack of policy ideas. The problem is the lack of a civil rights movement like we had in the 1960s that's now going to turn its attention to the redress of residential segregation. Redressing segregation has four main components. One is improving the resources in low-income segregated neighborhoods. Two is preventing massive dislocation of African Americans in particular from neighborhoods that are subject to gentrification pressures. Third is creating opportunities in high opportunity neighborhoods for African Americans and other non-white residents to live. And fourth is stabilizing desegregation where it exists. The policies to address each of these, as I say, are well known. What's missing is a new civil rights movement to make it uncomfortable to maintain the segregated patterns that exist. We have many policies today that we follow in this country that reinforce segregation. They are purportedly race neutral, but once we have a segregated system, you can have race neutral policies that reinforce it. Perhaps the biggest one that reinforces segregation is the low-income housing tax credit, a program of the federal government that issues tax credits to developers of low-income housing who disproportionately place that housing in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. The low-income housing units are placed in low-income segregated neighborhoods because it's easier for developers to do it that way. They can make lots of money more easily by placing low-income housing in existing low-income neighborhoods rather than challenging the segregation of higher opportunity neighborhoods where the families in that housing would have better opportunities to thrive. Developers who place that housing in low-income segregated neighborhoods don't have to hold a dozen community meetings explaining why you're bringing Black and brown people into that neighborhood. They can pay less for the land. Land is cheaper in low-income segregated neighborhoods. It's easy to rent because they can place a sign in the window saying for rent, and families who are eligible will walk by. The Section 8 voucher program is another one that reinforces segregation today. It's not a racially explicit program, but most Section 8 voucher holders can only use those vouchers in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. They can only use it there, for one thing, because the amount of the voucher is calculated based on the median rent in a wide metropolitan area. And you don't have to be a mathematical genius to figure out that the median rent is going to be too low. The median subsidy is going to be too low to rent an apartment in a high opportunity community. And it's actually too high to rent an apartment in a low-income segregated community. So landlords in those communities exploit the program by charging more than the market requires for Section 8 voucher holders. We also nationwide permit landlords to discriminate against Section 8 vouchers, to simply refuse to rent to a Section 8 voucher holder on the basis of the fact that part of their rent comes from the federal government. That also drives Section 8 voucher holders into existing low-income segregated neighborhoods. These policies are easy to reform. We have a few experimental programs, for example, that permit local housing jurisdictions, housing authorities to adjust the rents so that they're higher in high opportunity neighborhoods, the subsidies, and lower in low-income segregated neighborhoods. But it's only a small experimental program that should be done everywhere. The Treasury Department for the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program actually places a priority in placing low-income housing tax credit units in existing low-income neighborhoods. Doesn't say it's for the purpose of creating segregation, but that's what it does. Its rationale is that somehow concentrating poverty in these neighborhoods is going to improve the quality of life in those neighborhoods. It's nonsense. That policy should be reversed. It won't be reversed until we have a new civil rights movement in this country that demands its reversal. I'm involved with a group of national civil rights leaders to create something we call a new movement to redress racial segregation. We plan to organize local civil rights groups in various communities around the country where there's interest in doing so. and hope to create what John Lewis called good trouble, to make it uncomfortable to maintain the policies of segregation that we do maintain in Minneapolis and throughout the country in metropolitan areas. With that, I'll stop, and Chanda, I'd be glad to take questions and engage in the discussion with you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for such a thought-provoking overview, the richness of what's been provided. I think I said that last time we talked, it elicits such emotion from me, and just gets my wheels spinning in terms of how to reverse the damage that's been created in communities across this country. For those that are watching, I am paying attention to the chat. We do have a couple of questions, but I'm going to start with a few of sort of my questions and reflections that came up as you were talking. And top of mind for me is around policing, and you do cover that in your book, The Color of Law. And you talk about, you talked about in your discussion too, using violence as a way to maintain racial segregation. And then you went on to talk about how segregated, mostly low-income Black and Brown neighborhoods have allowed for police to terrorize. And I want to make sure that I heard this correctly, and that you're not suggesting, or maybe you are suggesting, that treatment that is fair and right is not conditional on Black and Brown people being proximate or living in white neighborhoods, or are you saying that?
Well, what I'm saying is that certainly there would be some police who would abuse African American and Hispanic young men, no matter where they lived. Derek Chauvin was an example of that. Mm-hmm. But the abuse of young African American and Hispanic men is much, much more intense because of residential segregation. In an integrated, desegregated neighborhood, stop and frisk policies, for example, routine, would never be tolerated. If we had a pattern of desegregation, it wouldn't be unusual to see a Black or brown face in a white neighborhood, and police wouldn't profile them and discriminate against them to the extent that they do now. So segregation makes police abuse much, much more intense. I'm not suggesting it wouldn't exist without it, but it makes it much, much more intense.
Yeah, and what I think I'm also reading from this is that by also being in relationship with each other, we have different accountabilities to each other that wouldn't allow for that treatment to persist. Yeah. Is that where you're headed?
Yeah, well, that's where you're headed. I agree with you.
Yeah, okay, we're in agreement. So the other one is around Langston Hughes and the integrated high school. And this is certainly the case and story across the country again, where, I'm coming to you all right now from North Minneapolis, where I went to North Community High School. My mom went there, my grandmother went there, and it was an integrated high school. And now my son is there, and it's not an integrated high school. And I think that this is a story that is a shared story, but I want to take or ask you, how did sort of the freeway systems, the interstate freeway system contribute to the segregation? Because that was a plan that has dislocated and disrupted communities, not just Rondo, where over 500 people were displaced, but across the country. And I know you speak of this, but how did that impact what you described for us in your talk of Langston Hughes' experience and integrated neighborhoods to segregated neighborhoods? Was that a contributor to that?
Yes, I'm, as you know, this is a book about a national story. I'm not familiar in detail with every community. I don't know about the interstate highway system in Minneapolis, but I do know this, that in many, many places in this country, and Minneapolis may be one of them, the routing of the interstate highway spurs that go into cities was racially explicitly designed to either destroy African-American neighborhoods that planners wanted to move away from, further away from whites or further away from downtown, or to create a barrier between Black and white neighborhoods. The federal policy manual, the underwriting manual that I described before, recommended that highways be used to separate Black and white neighborhoods. This was an official federal policy recommendation. In my book, I focus in Miami, where a highway was explicitly designed to destroy a thriving African-American but low-income neighborhood called Overton, and force the residents to move to a farther distant segregated neighborhood farther away from downtown Miami. So both policies were used. I spent a lot of years living in Chicago. The Dan Ryan Expressway there was, it's obvious, it was created to separate Black and white neighborhoods in Chicago, and it did so.
I'm going to go to a question from one of our listeners. Did underwriting manual or other federal documents exclude other races and groups in addition to African Americans, for example, Japanese Americans, Jews, and Catholics?
Well, the underwriting manual used the term inharmonious racial groups. But there was certainly discrimination in this country in the 20th century against all the groups that you mentioned. There was state-sponsored discrimination against them, but it would be a mistake to think that this was in any way similar to the segregation that African Americans experienced on the part of the federal, state, and local governments. What makes this country unique is the fact that we have never dealt with the legacies of slavery or of Jim Crow. So there's certainly policies of discrimination that need to be redressed that affect other groups. In particular, when you talk about the West Coast, there was state-sponsored, local state-sponsored discrimination against Mexican Americans, against Asians, against the Chinese and Japanese. It never rose to the level of the state-sponsored segregation of African Americans. And I can give you an example from California. The typical restrictive covenant in California prohibited residents of either Mongolian, meaning African American, or Hispanic or Asian in homes that were in white neighborhoods. But, as you know, the courts enforced restrictive covenants, frequently ordering African Americans who had moved into neighborhoods which were restricted for whites only, forcing them to give up their homes and move back out. The courts refused to enforce these covenants against Hispanics, even though the covenants explicitly said that they were designed to keep Mexicans out. They were enforced only against African Americans. The courts ruled in California that Hispanics were really Caucasians, and so the covenants didn't really affect them, apply to them. Now, I'm not suggesting that the discrimination that the Mexican Americans in particular faced in California wasn't very severe. It was, but it was nothing like what African Americans experienced. The experience of African Americans in this country is unique. It's a legacy of slavery. And as you know, in the beginning of The Color of Law, I take aim at this term people of color, as though there's no difference in the way African Americans and others were treated in this country. I think it's a mistake. We need to keep a strong focus on the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow.
Yeah. Does that federal manual still exist, or has it been revisited?
Oh, no, it doesn't. It doesn't still exist. I'm sure that there are manuals today that guide appraisers in recommending federal aid, but no. But you know, I can send you. I don't know if you're going to do a follow-up with this for this session with an email to people who are attending. I don't know if I can actually send you well, I think I can send you a link. I think it might be online to the underwriting manual of the 1930s that used this. I know the file is too big to attach it, but if you're going to send a follow-up email to attendees, I can send you
The link.
the link if there's a link. I know I think I photocopied it, but from a library, but I think there's a link to it now. It might have been digitized by now, so I will send it if you're going to send a follow-up.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Richard, can you share your thoughts on HOAs and how to prevent them from increasing segregation?
HOAs, what are HOAs?
For Jolene that asked that question, do you want to clarify that question? In the chat, if you could do that. I'm going to go to Jeff's and then I'll follow up so that I can be more explicit on that. I think we're talking about homeowners associations. The fees related to those. That's what I think we're talking about.
Well, yeah, okay. I've not heard them referred to as HOAs, but sure. In many cases, the restrictions that I described were not individual deed restrictions, but they were restrictions that cover the whole neighborhood that were created and enforced by homeowner associations of residents of a neighborhood. Frequently, they were organized. My emphasis, I'm interrupting myself, but my emphasis, as you know, is that this is an unconstitutional system. These were civil rights violations. And the homeowners associations that organized these restrictive covenants, not on deeds, but as homeowner association agreements, were frequently organized and led by tax-exempt institutions that received unconstitutional tax exemptions from the Internal Revenue Service. Churches were particularly guilty of this. They thought they could preserve ethnically homogenous parishes by excluding African Americans from living in their communities, and they organized frequently organized these homeowner associations to exclude African Americans. In 1948, the Supreme Court finally prohibited courts from evicting African Americans from homes that they had purchased in white neighborhoods, and that case stemmed from a neighborhood association organized by a local church to keep African Americans out in hopes that they wouldn't displace parishioners in the neighborhood of the church.
Let's see here, Richard. Some of us are discharging the racial covenants on our homes. These covenants are currently, questions keep coming in, so the thing keeps moving on me. I apologize. The covenants are currently illegal. Do you believe it's a helpful symbolic effort to have those covenants removed? It's symbolic and we know more is needed, but do you think that it's a useful step?
Well, you can't remove them.
Discharge, the word was discharge, so.
Well, you can't remove them. You can, take a black marker and black them out. You can, they're unenforceable. What I prefer to trying to remove them is to, because it's very difficult to remove them. It's expensive. It requires legal action. It has to be done case by case, deed by deed. And you can't change a deed. You can't wake up in the middle of the night and say, I want to change my property line. That's what the deed says. Any more than you can remove a covenant from it. What I recommend, and I say this in the color of law, is I think that legislatures should authorize homeowners to attach a new document to the deed saying that we're ashamed that this was once considered, that we live in a home where this was once considered acceptable. We repudiate this. We want to make a statement in our deed that we welcome people of all races and ethnicities to our neighborhood. Make it a positive statement of inclusion. rather than trying to wipe out history in a way that's not practically possible in any event. So that's my view of what the best approach is. You know, some people make an analogy to the removal of statues that commemorate, for example, generals that defended slavery. It's quite different. When if you try to sanitize a statue by placing a plaque, for example, at the bottom of it, contextualizing it, people don't notice the plaque. They walk right by and they still see the defender of slavery standing in their face. You can put a statement on your deed that is much more prominent than the underlying language in the deed, and it educates people about the history of the shameful history of their community and their very home. So I don't think they're analogous. And in any event, it's a lot harder. It's just a piece of paper, but it's a lot harder to remove a covenant from a deed than it is to remove a statue from a pedestal.
Understood. Minnesota has the second largest disparity gap of home ownership between white households and households of color. Is there any insight that you have on why this is?
Well, Chanda, you know, as you know, I've spent the last 5 years traveling around the country talking about this. And every place I go tries to convince me that they're worse than every place else when it comes to segregation. So maybe in this respect, Minneapolis is worse. But you know, you'd have a lot of competition from Chicago and Detroit and Atlanta and San Francisco, as I mentioned, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. So I don't know why this disparity exists to a greater extent than in Minneapolis. But I will say this: it's somehow tempting to focus on what makes places different in small ways than the underlying factors that make them similar in big ways. And I think that the people in Minneapolis would do well to focus on the underlying commonality that is true throughout the country when it comes to home ownership, than on the small difference that may exist in their own community that makes them perhaps worse in this respect than in others.
And so what would that be, or what would that look like? Like, you know, can you give an example of where you might focus?
Sure. I said before that the policies to redress segregation are well known. And let me give you an example of what a legitimate constitutional remedy for the home ownership gap would be. I mentioned earlier that the federal government subsidized whites to move into homes, single family homes in all white suburbs, and prohibited African Americans from doing so at a time when these suburban homes were inexpensive, $100,000, typically all over the country, not just in the example I gave, but all over. They cost approximately $100,000 in today's money. They now cost, you know, $400,000, $500,000, depending on the region of the country. In some places, $1 million or more. What the federal government should be doing as a narrowly targeted remedy for this very specific constitutional violation is buying up homes in these segregated white neighborhoods at market rates and reselling them at deeply discounted prices to African Americans to remedy their historic exclusion from those communities. This would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. There's no political support for doing something like that at this point. And so that's why I say we need a new civil rights movement. I wrote an article in the New York Times about a few months ago showing how in the absence of federal action, there's things that can be done by the private sector. In this article, I described a community, and I can, when I send you the underwriting manual, I can send you a link to this as well. You may be interested in this. I described a community that happened to be in California that was created as an all-white community in the 1940s. And with a little bit of research, I was able to identify the bank, the real estate agency, and the developer that collaborated with the federal government to create this all-white neighborhood. Well, that bank, that real estate agency, that developer still exist in that community today. And what a new civil rights movement should be doing in that community is pressing that bank, that real estate agency, that developer that created that segregated community to create its own fund to subsidize the movement of African Americans into that community because they can't afford to live there at current market prices, but they should be there. So that would be something that a local civil rights group could do, a campaign that it could undertake. There are some jurisdictions, let me say, that have, I don't know if Minneapolis does, that have a public down payment assistance programs they typically try to avoid Supreme Court gaze by not saying this specifically for African Americans. They sometimes talk about the first-time home buyers or people who live in the historically red-line neighborhoods. But these public programs do exist. They're fairly trivial, minor. They don't do a good enough job. The subsidies aren't great enough to really make a big impact, but they're a step in the right direction. And local civil rights groups should create pressure to expand them and deepen them.
Yeah. So Richard, so you're talking about repair. Are we talking about reparations at the core of what you're talking about now? And we know that there's HR 40 at the federal level that is making a case for some of the remedies that you're discussing now. Are you involved at all in that, or is that a place where people could lean in? Would it accompany housing?
Well, you know, I prefer to talk about policies, not reparations. I'm not opposed to reparations, but like I said,
isn't HR 40 a policy? Help me.
Well, yes, that's the thing. HR 40 is labeled a reparations program, but in fact, you know, John Conyers sponsored this bill when he was in Congress for years and years and years. It was titled a reparations bill, and nowhere in the bill did it mention reparations. It just talked about policies. When most people think of reparations, they think of a single monetary payment to the current generation. It would inevitably be token. It wouldn't do enough, nearly enough to remedy the segregation that we created, but it would give people an excuse to think that we've taken care of the problem now and we should move on. There are many policies that we should follow that would be very expensive and many that would cost nothing at all. The policies that I mentioned before, for example, to subsidize African Americans for home ownership in all white communities, that would be very expensive. The federal government was buying up homes at market rates and reselling them at this deeply discounted prices to African Americans. That would be an expensive policy. But the redesign of the Section 8 program so that Section 8 voucher holders had more access to high opportunity communities, that wouldn't cost much at all.
Yeah.
The redesign of the low-income housing tax credit program and a requirement that high opportunity communities accept those projects, that wouldn't cost much at all. So we need a mix of policies, some of which would be expensive, some of which would be no cost, some of which would be moderate cost, and focusing on reparations, which most people understand as a single payment, I think distracts us from the hard work that we need to do.
Okay. And then you've mentioned a couple of times sort of the new civil rights movement. Can you say more about what you mean?
Yeah, I think we need local committees of activists, biracial, multi-ethnic committees that are going to take action, take direct action to redress segregation first at the local level. Even before there's majority support at the local level for changing policy, there are things that can be done without majority support. I mentioned one a minute ago, and that is creating a pressure campaign for banks, for realtors, for developers to redress the segregation that they themselves created. One simple thing that a local civil rights group could do is look into the curriculum of their local schools and see if it's misteaching how we created segregation. And in The Color of Law, as you may know, well, you do know, you read the book, I examined all the textbooks that are commonly used in American high schools today, and they all lie about how segregation happened. They all promote this myth of de facto segregation. There could be a campaign led by local civil rights activists to get school districts, principals, teachers to adopt an accurate curriculum. Because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than previous generations have, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we have. This new movement to redress racial segregation has a curriculum unit that it's distributing. And again, if it's free, and if you want, I can send you a link to it, and you can distribute it to participants in this session, and they can take it to their school districts and insist that they have to use this one. There are others as well that teach this history accurately.
Yeah, there's so much that I could react to in that. And then, you know, based on what we've been in the last year and what the world has been in, we could argue that we might be in a civil rights movement that looks quite different than it did then, particularly around policing and criminal justice reform. And perhaps it will move into housing and the issues that we're talking about tonight. Erica Grant asked, what are your thoughts on racially discriminatory home appraisals, an issue that is being raised lately across the nation?
Well, you know, yes, it's being raised. There's lots of evidence that appraisers appraise African-American homes at a lower value than they appraise white owned homes. And this makes it more difficult for African-Americans to refinance their homes, for example. But I'm going to shift the question, if I may. This is the privilege of a speaker. I want to talk not about appraisals, but about assessments, which people confuse. Appraisals are something that's done privately in order to establish the value of a home for resale purposes or for financing purposes. Assessments are done by cities and counties to establish the value of a home. And nationwide, tax assessments, property assessments discriminate against African Americans. African Americans in cities across this country pay higher property taxes relative to the market value of their homes than whites pay. The result is that African Americans pay a tax, a race tax, when they pay their property taxes. It's often extremely high. Their property taxes are so high relative to the value of their homes compared to whites that frequently African Americans lose their homes because they can't pay their property taxes. They get foreclosed. This is a nationwide scandal. I mentioned earlier that once you have segregation established, race-neutral policies can perpetuate it. And the tax assessment systems that are used everywhere in the country are not explicitly racial, but they have a discriminatory effect that does enormous damage to African-American homeowners. And I can give you an example. Again, I can send you an article. There's a recent study done out of the University of Chicago, a political science professor at the University of Chicago, who analyzed virtually every city and county in the country, including yours, and demonstrated the extent to which African-American homeowners, well, in his study, he talks about low-income neighborhood homeowners. There's another study that specifically talks about race, pay higher property taxes than whites for homes of the same value. And there are many reasons for this. They're all superficially race neutral. One I wrote about a few years ago. Well, I talk about this in The Color of Law a bit, but I wrote an article a couple of years ago about Syracuse, New York, that hadn't done a property reassessment, a citywide property reassessment for 25 years. Well, in the intervening 25 years, property values in white neighborhoods increased much more rapidly than property values in Black neighborhoods. The result was that the assessments in white neighborhoods were far below the true market values of the homes, whereas assessments in Black neighborhoods were much closer to the market value of their homes. That meant that African Americans were paying much higher taxes relative to their market values than whites were paying. There are many other reasons for this as well. I'll send you these articles. If I guess I'm making a list of more and more things I should send you. But if your listeners are interested in them,
I believe they
can
are.
look
There's
at
so
them.
many,
Yeah.
so many more questions that we're going to be unable to get to, but I'll go to Luke Hansen's question. It might be the last. He asked, what are the most effective ways to push back against the absurd perspective that housing segregation is a de facto reality and that the government and not government sponsored and state enforced?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. What's the most effective way of explaining this to people?
Yeah, or to push back. I mean, you know this, it happens in school, and you laid out, that some of the narratives, I guess the narrative around, right? The communities are too poor to live here, all of the stuff that we hear. What do you have to offer in terms of?
Well, I don't like repeating myself, but you're asking me to. The way to push back is to get together with friends and neighbors, biracial group citywide, create a new civil rights group, force the local school district to teach this history accurately so that the next generation will be in a better position to remedy it. Begin to look at the actions, discriminatory actions in your community, the placement of light tech units, for example, that reinforce segregation, the placement of Section 8 voucher holders, and take action locally that can begin the process of creating a climate where eventually national policies have to be addressed. But the civil rights movement of the 1960s didn't start with national policy. It started with local activists taking action in their own communities, and they gradually raised the temperature of segregation to the point where the country had to act. And I think the same thing is going to be necessary when it comes to this biggest segregation of all. Like I say, this underlies so much else, so much racial inequality in so many aspects. I think it's a fantasy to think that it can be resolved simply by think tanks throwing out new policy ideas. It's going to take activists, it's going to take engaged citizens, and this has to be it can't be done, from your living rooms, even though we have a pandemic. It's going to have to be done with direct action on the part of civil rights activists.
And can anyone be a civil rights activist, Richard?
Anyone can be, yes. In fact, this is a role of Americans to do. We have an unconstitutional system of segregation. We have an obligation, all of us as Americans, to redress it. And we should take up that obligation.
I appreciate you spending time with us in our city. I think that if we have not learned in the last 11 months or so, the deeply entrenched racist policy and patterns and practices that exist in all of our systems, then we have not been paying attention. And we appreciate your work spotlighting how that has shown up in housing and in segregation across the country. We appreciate all of the invitations for you to follow up with the links so that we can continue to do our work to advance public policy that can hopefully remedy and do no further damage. We are, I love the book. I've shared this with you before, and I share it wherever I can go. And I invite everyone on here tonight listening, if you haven't read it, I think, I invite you to do so. So I just thank everyone for listening. This conversation was recorded. I saw that question in the panel, and Barb has popped in, and I think my duty is done, Barb. Thank you. And Richard, nice to see you again.
It's great seeing you. Thank you very much. And I'll try to develop these links tomorrow and get them to you.
Perfect.
Thanks, Chanda, for an engaging conversation. Thanks, Richard. We've been waiting a year to talk with you in here in Minneapolis. Thanks so much for taking time with us this evening. And thanks to all the folks who joined us tonight. I work for Alliance Housing in Minneapolis. We're an affordable housing developer, owner, and manager. And we focus on folks with the lowest income and often those who are screened out by other landlords. And I originally got interested in Richard's book because most of our tenants are very low income and African American. And while we're happy to be the manager of really high quality places for them to call home, I knew it just exemplified some of the racial inequities in the housing system and the economic system that are just baked into these systems. And I think the book Color of Law really spotlights how we ended up here and why we live in these systems. And it'll take more than one conviction of one police officer or one new program or one new change to a deed to really make the systemic change to some of these systems where racial discrimination is just baked in from the very beginning. So we welcome all of you as new civil rights activists, and Sophie is providing a link, I believe, in the chat. You can check out the websites of all of our partners here in putting on this event tonight, and perhaps you'll be inspired with some of the work we do and will join in. So thanks again, and I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Barb. And thanks again, Richard and Chanda. It's just so incredibly important and inspiring to hear your words and sobering as well. So thanks for giving us your time tonight. Thanks to all of you who participated in this event. It was just wonderful to see so many people here. And like Barb says, we've got the beginnings of the new movement, we hope. Also wanted to do a couple other thank yous as housekeeping. Thanks to those of you who have participated and donated in the pay as you can portion of this event. This is something we've been doing with our online events the past year, and it really helps make this accessible to people of all financial means. And so it's just so wonderful for those of you who can pay to give that support. It's been a really nice model for us, and we're just so delighted to see that working. Thanks again to our sponsors. Speaking of financial support, Minneapolis Foundation and the Polad Family Foundation, who helped make this possible. And let me just underscore Barb's acknowledgement of Plymouth Congregational Church and Align Minneapolis, working with Hennepin History Museum and Alliance Housing. Barb mentioned Sophie, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Sophie Hunt, who's been the master behind a lot of the stuff here tonight behind the scenes, but Sophie's our public programs manager, and she did a lot of the heavy lifting these past weeks to pull this event together. So just wanted to call her out. Keep a watch on hennepinhistory.org. I was delighted to see Richard just forecasting our upcoming year of programming, talking about highways. We've been doing with the U of M a public history of 35W, and as you saw, some of you saw in the chat, yes, indeed, all of those housing or transportation policies at the federal level hit home here in Minneapolis as well. So the ongoing programming for the public history of 35W will culminate in an exhibit at Hennepin History Museum this fall. And we're also doing a pop-up exhibit out in the landscape around the Hale Field schools. We're coming up this year on the 50th anniversary of the Hale Field merger, which was one of the early things in Minneapolis to try to address school segregation. And Richard talked at some length about how the school segregation was a direct outgrowth of this housing segregation. We're dipping our toe in that water this summer, and we're looking forward to working with the U of M for the next couple of years on really delving into that issue, which is the next stage of this whole story. So there's lots more to come. Keep your eyes on us, and we'll try to keep telling these stories. And with that, thanks again to everyone, and have a great night.